In this Revit tutorial, I want to discuss grid lines, when you might use them, and how they work. On the Architecture tab, under the Datum panel, we have the option to put in grid lines. This is the same location that we found the level lines that we put in the elevation views. Unlike level lines, which are pretty much required when you're using Revit, grid lines aren't really necessary, but they're extremely useful and helpful when you're doing large-scale projects that have columns. So that's really when you think about using grids, is when you're going to be putting in columns, especially structural columns. So to put in a grid line, what you want to do is first make sure you're on the level that you want the grid to be on. If I go to my project browser under the floor plans, I have levels 1, 2, and 3, so I'll just say level 1 is fine. So on level 1, I'll then come up and pick grid. There are a few more placing grid options in the contextual tab under the draw panel than we had for levels. So we can draw straight lines, and we can pick existing lines if we had them, just like we could for levels, but now we can actually draw arcs and things like that. So it is actually possible to have grid lines that aren't perfectly straight. And you'll see down in the contextual ribbon here that we could even offset them if we were picking existing lines, for example. So I'm just going to place them in with straight lines. And to place the grid on the floor plan view, basically just click my first starting point and then end, and you'll see that I have grid line number 1. Okay. So I could just put in a few extra grid lines here just so you can get the idea. So right now I'm putting them in vertically, but I could certainly make my way and put in some horizontal grid lines so I have some intersecting points as well. Take note when I put these in that the point I start with is kind of the empty end, if you will, and the point where I click actually gets the bubble and the number in it. Once I have the grids in place, I can either hit escape twice to get out of the command, or just come up to the ribbon and click on the modify tool. Remember, the modify tool is the one stationary element on the ribbon that no matter where I click, what tab I happen to be on, that modify tool is always right there. Once you have your grid lines in place, or at least roughed in, you can use temporary dimensions to actually drive their placement and get them where you want them. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. If I click on any one of these grid lines, let's say I click on the left line over here, you'll see that it's telling me it's exactly 48 feet from this left grid line, number 1, to grid line number 2. If I click on grid line number 2, you'll see I have 48 feet between 1 and 2 here, which of course makes sense, and then 64 feet from 2 to 3. If I want to change these measurements, I can simply have one of these activated and then change the temporary dimension, and here I have 2 different options. If I came in with grid line number 2 activated and change that from 48 to 55, you'll see that it actually moved that middle grid line over. And that might be great, that might be just what I want. Now if I want to keep this space between here 55 feet, and then this space over here at a different measurement, I have to be careful. Let's say I want this one to be 55 and this one to be 65, for example. If I come in and now change this one to 65, enter, it's shoved the line back to the left. That's because Revit will move whichever one you have highlighted. So I'm just going to come in, change that one back to 55, and now I would need to make a new selection, select the right grid line, and then change that number. So it's very important that you pick what you want to move before you actually change those numbers. So if I wanted to change the space in between here, Right now it's at 64 feet. If I wanted to change that number, as it is now, I have that lower line selected. If I change that to 50, it will move that bottom line up. So that's really using the temporary dimensions to your advantage. Once we have these in place, we're all set up to put in walls and columns and that type of thing, and we can use these to line up our structural columns.